Hi, my name is Cody Hosterman, and I'll be demonstrating self-service database dev test with vRealize automation. So let's first, of course, log into vRealize Automation's web portal. I'll be logging in first with an administrator. This administrator has full privileges to my tenant. So when I log in, I see all of my services. My storage as a service, production virtual machines as a service, and of course, development virtual machines as a service. These all have their own independent workflows, catalog items rather, that different users will be able to access. So let's log in as a user with more restricted privileges. So I'm going to log in as one of my production SQL admin. I have access to a lot fewer workflows inside of the interface this user sees. You can see all I can do is request a SQL server that's in production. So I already have a SQL server that's been requested and spun up, and so I can go and take a look at it. Some basic information about my virtual machine and the ability to connect to it. Not really a lot of options. I can't turn it off, I can't delete it, I can't change it. So I'm going to launch one of the workflows that starts an RDP session into my Windows machine hosting this SQL server. So I immediately log in and I can see I have my SQL Server Management Studio up and running. And what I want to do is I want to create a new database. But first I want to add a new virtual disk to host that database. So I do have one workflow in here that adds a production virtual disk to my production SQL Server. This workflow actually has its own set of reservations so that these virtual disks will only go to a certain set of data stores in my vCenter. Data stores that I know host production SQL databases. So my request is in progress. I can go over to vRealize Orchestrator, which is actually running that workflow to see that it's completed successfully. Inside of my VM, I can see I now have a new virtual disk that's been added. I'll go ahead and enable and online this virtual disk and then format it with NTFS. This workflow is pretty default. It always is going to be 200 gigs, it's always going to be 0 thick, but you can of course configure that or allow separate configurations depending on what you need. So now I want to change my default settings for my database to always put those databases on my E drive, which is my new virtual disk. So now I'll restart my database, so it applies that new default database location. And once that restart has completed, we'll go and create a new database inside my SQL Server that will be on that E drive. My SQL Server is back up. I will now create a new database. I'm just going to call vRealize and hit OK. And that database, those database files are now on my E drive. So we're good to go. Our production database is running and adding data and querying and so forth to that database. So now let's say, hey, I have some data on there. I want to bring it over to my development environment and I want to run some specialized queries or some changes or performances or whatever on that development copy. So my virtual disk has been put on a database called, or a data store rather, called SQL Prod Data. If we take a look at it, you can see that virtual disk, that hard disk 2 to that VM that's been added is indeed on that data store. So what we want to do is we want to make a copy of it, and we're going to use array-based technologies, array-based snapshotting and data store recovery to recover that data store from my development environment. So I'm going to log in as my storage administrator. So my storage administrator has some different credentials. And they, instead of having access to provisioning VMs and so forth, they have access to managing the FlashArray, its volumes, its snapshots. And you can see this storage admin has access to that data store. They own this as an item inside of vRealize Automation. And they can run certain workflows from it. So here are my action items, which I have a bunch of different workflows that I can run, are vRealize Orchestrator workflows built into the FlashArray plugin. So I'm going to run one of these requests. This request is just going to create a new FlashArray snapshot of that database, of that data store hosting that database rather. And I can give it a suffix as well to uniquely identify it to me. So now that I've requested that snapshot to be created, vRealize Orchestrator is going to go to the FlashArray and create that snapshot. If I look at the VRO workflow, you can see that there's an instance of that workflow that's run, and you can see that's the snapshot that was created. If I go to my FlashArray itself, I can verify this information as well. I'd see here's my VRA snap that I created, or I asked VRO and VRA to create for me. That workflow also returns that snapshot back to that end user. That's of course optional if you want it to be returned, but this one does. So I now own that snapshot as a custom item inside of vRealize Automation. And furthermore, I have some workflows that I can run on that snapshot. And these workflows are infrastructure as a service blueprints based on vRealize Orchestrator workflows that we offer in the FlashArray plugin. So I want to create a new data store out of the snapshot. So I'm going to give it a cluster, confirm the FlashArray, and then give it a data store name, something that's friendly that makes sense to me. Because at the end of this process, it's going to create a new volume from that snapshot point in time. It's going to connect it to the host group that corresponds to that vCenter cluster, and then it's going to resignature and mount that data store, and then rename it to that name I requested. So this process is going to run through, and we can once again check in vRealize Orchestrator to see, hey, what's the status of this process? So here's the log information going through, correlating my host group and so forth, and it's already at the point where it's rescanning my vCenter cluster for that new device. You can see there's the rescan operation going through in the vSphere web client. So the last process of this VRO workflow is, of course, resignature that volume and mount it to my various ESX servers in that cluster. You can see my new data store has been created, and now it's doing the rename process. If we look at my data stores, we can see that the volume has now appeared and it's been renamed and ready to go. So let's go back into vRealize automation. The last part of that is created a new data store, and so that data store has been once again returned back to that end user. So I now have a new data store that I own. SQL dev data. This is the resignatured copy of that prod data that I created before using these workflows. And I then can go therefore and delete it and remove it or do whatever I need to do with it furthermore as well. So now let me log in as my development SQL administrator. So I'm ready to use that point in time copy. And so in my catalog item, I only have one request, and it is I want to request a new SQL Server dev copy. So I'll give it a description and a reason for the request and fill out the remaining parts of this form. So this is going to use a standard vRealize automation blueprint that spins up a VM from a template. And it's also going to have its own vCenter customization specification and things like that. One of the things you'll notice about this workflow is I have it in an approval mode. So whether it be a custom action on an object or just a catalog item, you can also add approvals that require some administrator to say, yes, you can do this. The admin doesn't need to walk through the process. They don't need to create the volume. They don't need to create the VM. But they can say, yes, what you're requesting is fine with me. I approve it. And then vRealize automation goes and does that for you. And so I can see the details of my requirements, or my request rather, and I can go ahead and approve it or deny it, depending on what I feel. So I'm going to approve this request and log back in as my SQL development user or administrator. Once I've logged in, I can check the status of my request. It has been approved and is now in progress. And so inside of vCenter, that VM is being deployed from template. It'll be powered on. If there's a customization specification, which I have, will be applied to that virtual machine. You can see that top event there in the recent tasks, indeed customizing that virtual machine. So now that the process is almost complete, we'll just wait for it to change to successful. It is now successful. So let's take a look. And that VM has now been returned to my item inventory. So I can own a virtual machine just like I can own a data store or a FlashArray snapshot. And so I'll click on my instance of this VM that I deployed. You can see I have a lot more options. It's a development virtual machine. So I can delete it, I can expire it, I can reboot it, I can shut it down, I can whatever. There's a lot more options I can do because it's development. It's not a production virtual machine. vRealize automation allows you to give very granular levels of control and access to specific types of items or specific items in general. So now I'm going to RDP into my SQL Dev instance. Of course, you can use Remote Console or SSH with Linux and so forth. And I'm going to bring up my database. So the first thing we see that we just have a C drive, we don't have an E drive, we don't have a copy. If we look at my disk manager inside of Windows, we see I only have one current virtual disk to this VM. So what we need to do is actually take that VMDK, that virtual disk copy that's been brought up on that development data store that I spun up earlier, and attach to that VM. And so what I'm going to do here is run a request, give me the virtual disk that corresponds to the production VM of my corresponding development VM so I can run my tests on it. And of course, this can be configured in any way. What I'm using is relating the names. Hey, this is my production VM. Give me the virtual disk so I can give it to the corresponding development VM. So that workflow has been run, and those databases have been added because that virtual disk has been automatically added to that virtual machine. And of course, we can bring up the SQL Server Management Studio and attach that database. And the database is attached, and now I can run my queries and my tests and so forth. So that's a demonstration of vRealize automation and the Pure Storage FlashArray. Some options about automating, creating data storage, virtual machines, whatever. vRealize automation is a powerful product and allows you to apply the self-service that you need for your end users. Thank you.